Right. Welcome everyone to Art at Noon this week. I am always excited for these talks. I am a big student and a big fan of Dr. Anna Marley. Before we get started, I want to thank our the sponsors of the Art at Noon program in the spring. Art at Noon lectures are supported by the Lefko family in memory of a beloved member of the docent corps, Mildred T. Lefko. And I also, before we get started, because I know we're going to get lost in our questions, I want to tell you about our next Art at Noon. I'm very excited. It's going to be Wednesday, May 29th, and it will feature Leah Triplett Harrington, PAFA's Director of Exhibitions and Contemporary Curatorial Initiatives. Leah is going to take a deep dive into the life and work of Miriam Shapiro, discussing her contributions to the pattern and decoration movement and how her work continues to influence artists working today. So here's a link for that so you can register. It is my honor to introduce Anna Marley, Chief of Curatorial Affairs and the Kenneth R. Woodcock Curator of Historical American Art. Anna Marley joined PAFA in March of 2009. Marley is a scholar of American art and material culture from the colonial era to 1945 and holds a BA in art history from Vassar College, an MA in museum studies from the University of Southern California, and a PhD from the University of Delaware. At PAFA, Marley has curated over 16 exhibitions, including Public Treasures, Private Visions, Hudson River School Masterworks in 2009, Anatomy Academy in 2011, A Mine of Beauty, Landscapes by William Trost Richards, edited the company catalog, as well as the touring retrospective, Henry Ossawa Tanner, Modern Spirit. These happened both in 2012. And editing the acclaimed accompanying catalog published by the University of California Press. Marley's more recent exhibitions at PAFA include Spiritual Strivings, a celebration of African-American works on paper in 2014, the 5-venue nationally touring Artists' Garden, American Impressionism, and the Garden Movement, 1887 to 1920. That happened in 2015, and the accompanying catalog published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Thomas Aikens, photographer, in 2016, and From the Schuylkill to the Hudson, Landscapes of the Early American Republic in 2019. Then she curated Women in Motion, 150 Years of Women's Artistic Networks at PAFA in 2021. And then most recently, Making American Artists, Stories from PAFA 1776 to 1996. That exhibited at PAFA in 2022, but it is currently traveling on a 6-venue national tour in 2023. And that brings us to her current exhibition that she co-curated with Leah Triplett Harrington, Artists as Cultivators, and that is going to be on view at PAFA through July 7th. So I hope if you haven't been able to see the show, come and see it. It's truly a deeply moving exhibition. Welcome, Anna, and we are excited for your talk today.
Thank you so much, Lori, for that fabulous introduction. And yes, the answer is I don't sleep. That's how I curate all those exhibitions. We have a great team here at PAFA, and I'm thrilled to be returning to my 2015 exhibition, which was an inspiration for our current exhibition, Artists as Cultivators, which, as Lori said, is up through the 7th of July. And I would love for you to hear this talk and then come back in May to hear Leah's talk. Come see the show. And we also have an amazing yoga series starting soon in the rotunda of the exhibition. So please enjoy that as well and sign up for that. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to get this project on the road. So, okay, hopefully this looks good to everyone. Okay, so, oops. The Artist's Garden, American Impressionism and the Garden Movement. And this talk today is based on the book and catalog from 2015. In 1907, the landscape architect Beatrix Farrand wrote in her essay, The Garden as Picture, that, quote, The two arts of painting and garden design are closely related, except that the landscape gardener paints with actual color, line, and perspective to make a composition, as the maker of stained glass does, while the painter has but a flat surface on which to create his illusion. The painter has another great advantage over the gardener because, as he cannot possibly transfer to canvas the millions of colors and shadows which make up the most ordinary landscape, he must eliminate so many. While painters might well disagree with Farrand's assessment of their advantage over gardeners, these artists included in our 2015 exhibition, The Artist's Garden, would concur with her pairing of art and painting and garden design. Descended from generations of gardeners that make up the Cadwallader family of Philadelphia, Farrand, like many of the artists and gardeners considered in the publication, and that we're going to look at today, was never more than a few degrees separated from the fertile gardening and arts community that is Philadelphia. I open with Farrand's words as they bring together many of the seemingly disparate elements: garden writing, impressionist painting, autochromes, the importance of light and movement as expressed in the exhibition in oil paintings, watercolors, autochrome, stained glass, garden magazines, and books, as well as sculpture. The Artist's Garden exhibition and catalog tells the intertwining stories of American artists, Impressionism, and the growing popularity of gardening as a middle-class leisure pursuit at the turn of the 20th century. No previous exhibition or publication on American Impressionist gardens has trained a critical focus on the gardens, artists, suburbs, and exhibitions of the greater Philadelphia area and their important generative role in a national garden movement. This project examined how the horticultural and visual arts in Philadelphia were artistic and environmental manifestations of an emerging national progressive era middle-class American identity. Farrand's statement demonstrates the intertwining of seemingly disparate elements of American Impressionist painting and turn-of-the-century gardening practices. The period of focus that we're looking at here, the progressive era, which goes from the 1890s to 1920s, is recognized as one of intense political, social, and artistic change in the United States. The decades from 1887 to 1920 saw an upsurge in nationalist feeling inspired by the afterlife of the Centennial Exhibition of 1876, anxieties about mass European immigration, agitation for universal women's suffrage, the advent of World War I and concomitant war gardens, the emergence of a robust middle class eager to make their mark on the American landscape, and the arrival of French Impressionist painting and principles in American galleries and studios. The garden movement in the US was a product of and impetus for many of these changes. This movement was driven by American suburban lifestyle at the turn of the century that was linked to the development of railroad suburbs, an interest in the creation of garden cities and public parks, and the influence of arts and crafts principles first articulated in late 19th century Great Britain. Born in the nostalgic atmosphere of the colonial revival, the garden movement represents a national and middle-class enthusiasm for cultivating gardens that were intimate and seen as distinctly American. Held in Philadelphia in 1876, the Centennial Exhibition introduced the colonial revival movement, and thus a new wave of interest in American gardens, and that's putting that in quotes. The colonial revival was a nationalistic movement that sought to revive elements of architectural style, garden design, and interior design of American colonial architecture. While the Centennial of 1876 reawakened Americans to their colonial past, the movement gained particular momentum in the 1890s. And I'm showing you a book from this period, as well as some images of some of the buildings in Fairmount Park from the Centennial Exhibition. Through the values of the progressive era, including the rise of a strong middle class and the definition of an American national identity, a middle-class gardening community emerged. Intensely pruned gardens tended by hired hands, such as were seen on the estates of the country's robber barons, were rejected in favor of commuter gardens, personal plots that amateur gardeners filled with native and wild flowers. The American gardens depicted in impressionist paintings of the US in this period were for the most part not the grand estates of the wealthy, but those of an aspiring middle class, of which artists were often members. In an article published in The Garden magazine of 1915, B.Y. Morrison addresses this audience saying, quote, "This article is not for the people who leave their gardens to the care of a hired man. The owner must belong to that demented clan who go out before breakfast to see the new peony buds and who come in by way of the office to the garden to see what the sun has opened during the day." In the very popular 1901 publication, The Garden of a Commuter's Wife, the author, who lived in Fairfield, Connecticut, critiques her neighbor's showy Italian garden and describes her own as a purely American garden. In The Commuter's Wife Lament, there is both a race and a class component, as the Italian or French garden of the time was associated not only with the great estates of the Gilded Age elite, but with recent Italian immigrants, whereas the American colonial or wild garden was deemed both patriotic and appropriate for a new class of suburban commuters. This quote reveals that not all the progressive ideals that found their way into the garden were positive. Disturbed by the growth of immigrant communities eager for work in the cities, the middle class began an exodus to the suburbs, where new neighborhoods in the country provided space for individual amateur gardening. Further, anxiety over the country's changing demographics through immigration also prompted interest in nativism. And in this case, native breeds of birds or flowers were celebrated for their genesis in American soil. A burgeoning environmental awareness also brought attention to these species. Members of the Audubon movement brought their conservationist principles into the garden and social life. These concerns were manifested in the garden of one particular horticultural leader. I'm showing you here Thalia Thaxter, and the artist who illustrated her garden, Childe Hassam. And in particular, she is pictured here in this image by Hassam not wearing a hat because she was very active in protecting bird species. And it was a form of protest to never have a hat, even while she was gardening, to signal the damage being brought to native bird species by the millinery trade. Impressionist artists in particular were invoked by garden aficionados in period magazines, where the connection was explicit between contemporary American gardens and the painterly movement. Quote, "The color scheme had been carefully planned last winter and is as cheerfully disregarded now, as some new inspiration strikes us, such as a border of purple asters against salvia, with white dahlias behind a strip of daring fall color, which would delight the soul of Gary Milkers, which delighted me, and which my wife said was horrible." End quote. Thus, the garden movement was not only carried out in garden plots. American artists, painters, sculptors, stained glass designers, and more contributed to this world through their production of works of gardens on paper, canvas, and glass. The increasing professionalization of art making in the US meant that artists too were members of this aspiring middle class that pioneered the garden movement. Many of these artists had traveled to Europe, especially France, where they were exposed to the modernist style of Impressionism. Lingering in the French countryside and in the public parks of Paris, they experimented with Impressionist principles of plein air painting, the study of light with direct, unmediated composition, and the application of unmodulated color in quick brushstrokes. The first exhibition of French Impressionism in the US opened at the Durand Ruel Gallery in New York City in 1886. In the United States, as in Europe, the concerns and techniques of Impressionism made the outdoor garden a natural, perennially inspiring subject of art. By 1887, American artists were traveling to Claude Monet's famous garden of Giverny to study with the Impressionists. Whether or not American artists wholly subscribed stylistically to European Impressionism, they were forced to grapple with the sea change it brought to modern art and culture. While artists such as John Breck, Frederick Carl Frieseke, and Theodore Robinson cast themselves in the stylistic mold of French Impressionists, other painters, including Hugh Henry Breckinridge, Mariah Oakey-Dewing, and Childe Hassam, filtered its principles through their own vision to create a distinctive style. For example, in the case here of Dewing, her painterly style cannot be described as Impressionist, but her insistence on the study and painting of flowers en plein air was a product of the impact of French Impressionism on American painters. Even outside the art world, the language of Impressionism permeated American society, informing how people talked about the speed of modern life, the cadence of their poetry, and the spectacle of their gardens. Even a traditionally academic painter like Anna Lee Merritt espoused an Impressionist aesthetic when it came to the description of gardening in her book, An Artist's Garden. Like Merritt, many artists wrote about gardens, and numerous articles from the period document what artists thought about how to paint flowers, but also as to why it was considered valuable to paint in the garden. Jane Peterson published an article in the Garden magazine in September 1922, talking about her great and absorbing passion for flowers. In 1910, she began painting in Louis Comfort Tiffany's garden in Long Island. And between then, in 1914, she produced a series of great garden pictures. Peterson explained her interest in flowers for reasons formal, scientific, and sentimental. She loved painting flowers for their, quote, prismatic hues of the rainbow, and because they were, quote, all that is delicate, all that is lurid, brilliant, bizarre, end quote. She wrote of their structure and decorative quality, saying that, as a designer, I have conventionalized them and used them for patterns, and also their individuality by painting them, quote, realistically in bunches, paying careful attention to the characteristic of each individual specimen. She concludes her essay with the statement, I adore gardens. They are the most elusive art of a nation. Peterson's Spring Bouquet, which you can see currently in Artists as Cultivators, incorporates all of these elements. The color palette she uses is brilliant and almost lurid, especially in the orange of the poppies, which are echoed in the bright orange of the woman's headdress. The steep tilted perspective of post-impressionism and the inherent sense of pattern and the composition of the background are complemented in the foreground of individual specimens which can be identified by genus, such as bearded iris, lilies, and poppies. The flowers she chooses are as fashionable as the up-to-date gown and headdress. Oh, thank you for joining us. Can you please mute?
Yes, I have to because I saw these.
Thank you. She shows her central figure reaching out to touch the flowers in the garden. This imparts a sense of tactility of the flowers to the viewer, and the gesture may also be a sign of rebellion on Peterson's part, for she wrote that her mother always forbade her to touch the flowers in the garden. The National Garden Movement, and in particular, artists' interest in gardens, has deep roots in Philadelphia. Almost every artist I'm looking at today taught, studied, or exhibited at PAFA during their lifetimes. Additionally, many of these artists were keenly involved in the horticultural arts. Philadelphia was a national leader in the garden movement, and the city has a long and distinguished gardening history. From the city's founding as William Penn's green and pleasant town in the 17th century, to the establishment of John Bartram's Botanical Garden in 1728, to Charles Wilson Peel's retirement to and cultivation of his garden at Belfield in the early 19th century. right up to the period that I'm focusing on here. The Pennsylvania Horticultural Society was founded in 1827, and 2 years later hosted its first flower show, which many of you know continues to this day. In her popular 1901 colonial revival-inspired publication, Old Time Gardens, Alice Morse Earle wrote of Philadelphia, quote, "Their floriculture reached by the time of the Revolution a very high point, and many exquisite gardens bore ample testimony to the pride of life, as well as the love of flowers of Philadelphia friends." And that's a capitalized F. So I'm showing you here a very Quakerly colonial revival garden at Stenton in Germantown. In fact, the colonial gardens of Philadelphia became even more popular and celebrated after the Centennial Exhibition. This era was a particularly fecund period for floriculture in Philadelphia. The Morris family began work on their garden, what is now Morris Arboretum, in 1887. Already the center of publishing in the US at the turn of the century, the city also became a center of horticultural publishing. The influential House and Garden magazine was founded in Philadelphia in 1901. Prompting and responding to this changing taste in gardening was a proliferation of horticultural publications that were celebratory and inclusive and instructive by turn. The Garden Club of Philadelphia was founded in 1904 in the Gardens of Andalusia, home of the Biddle family, and hosted by Mrs. Charles Biddle. In 1910, the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women was founded at what is now Temple University Ambler Arboretum. The Garden Club of America was founded in the gardens at Stenton in Germantown in 1913, with the mission, quote, "to stimulate the knowledge and love of gardening among amateurs, to share the advantages of association through conference and correspondence in this country and abroad, and to aid in the protection of native plants, birds, and to encourage civic planting." The founding of these garden clubs, centers of education, and publications was embedded within the progressive era's intense social activism and political reform. Horticultural obsession also permeated the Philadelphia art scene. One can see it in PAFA's annual exhibition design, where floral elements are incorporated into the installation of paintings and sculpture. And I'm showing you here two views of PAFA's rotunda, one from 1907 and one from the show here in 2015. One of the most iconic conjunctions of art and the garden in Philadelphia is the commissioning of Maxfield Parrish and Tiffany Studio's fabulous Dream Garden for the Curtis Building. The work was commissioned by Edward Bach, the head of Curtis Publishing, the influential publisher of Ladies' Home Journal, for the company's headquarters. The Dream Garden embodies many of the central stories of the exhibition. The mural was made by two artists whose gardens were of central importance to their oeuvre. Maxfield Parrish's home in the Cornish colony, famous for its gardens, was an inspiration for the mural. Tiffany's garden at his estate in Long Island was not only an inspiration for his stained glass, but for other artists as well. And I'm showing you a really beautiful Tiffany window from a private collection just outside of Philadelphia. Today, I explore various aspects of what we might call a horticultural impulse in American Impressionist art, from the gardens of artists to the magazines that celebrated and influenced them, from the emergence of the modern American conservation movement and debates about immigration to technologies of mass reproduction and emerging fields of landscape architecture. The art in the exhibition and book consists of gardens, urban and suburban, real and ideal. And central to it all is the role of the American artist in gardening culture. In her 1908 book, An Artist's Garden Tended, Painted, and Described, Anna Lee Merritt, a Philadelphia-born artist transplanted onto British soil, wrote that, quote, "An artist's interest in gardening is to produce pictures without brushes, and I have resorted to weary paintings only to show the effect of groups and arrangements that gratify me. Like Merritt, many of her contemporary artists work to create pictures without brushes in their own gardens and produce some of the most exciting, unclassifiable, and understudied examples of turn-of-the-century American gardening, paintings, and photography. In gardens up and down the eastern seaboard and across the Atlantic, these artists nurtured communities, cultivated American flowers, and experimented with color and form. They exhibited their paintings in prestigious venues across the US, such as the annuals at PAFA, and disseminated their writing about and photography of their gardens in the many national publications devoted to home and garden that mushroomed in the first decades of the 20th century. For the rest of our time this afternoon, I'm going to discuss some of the gardens, physical, artistic, and literary, of Merritt and her fellow artist gardeners. I will explore how the companion arts of gardening and painting result in works of art that are intimate, personal, and complex. For the artists discussed here, the garden was a domestic space, but also a space of technical experimentation. They wrote about gardens, painted them, and lived in them. Through their treatment of the garden, we can see how expansive the definition of American Impressionism can be. From the flower portraits of Mariah Oakey Dewing to the women as flowers by Charles Curran and Lillian Westcott and Philip Leslie Hale, and the wildflower sketches of John Twachtman. These artists are unanimous in their interest in the garden as part of their artistic practice, but with very different results. I'm not arguing that all these artists were Impressionists, but I do assert that the Impressionist movement, along with an emerging middle-class identity bound up in retreating from the city, was crucial to how these artists conceived of and executed their practice. The lives of two period authors, one an artist gardener, the other a landscape architect gardener, demonstrate the conflicted nature of American Impressionism when it comes to gardening imagery and literature of the period. Anna Massey Lee was born in Philadelphia in 1844 and studied anatomy at Women's Medical College before moving to England to marry the artist Henry Merritt. In England, she was associated with the British Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood painters. She gave up painting for gardening and was a very popular gardening authority amongst her contemporaries. She wrote that her intention in publishing an artist garden was to impart her delight, quote, in the cult of arranging pictures to bloom in living colors and vary as swiftly as the cinematograph, end quote, invoking the newly created medium of film along with painting and gardening. But she also wrote, quote, I have not acquired the latest Impressionist style, which so ably represents things as seen from a motor car at full speed, end quote. She seems here to have a very ambivalent attitude towards technology and to modernity, as well as to Impressionism. Is her garden a retreat or a celebration? On one hand, she compares her garden to the cinema, but on the other, she critiques Impressionism as a view from a speeding car. In her painting technique, she is decidedly academic, yet she chose to have her book illustrated with one of the most modern reproductive technologies, the chromolithograph, and that's what you're seeing here. The landscape architect Beatrix Farrand was similarly critical of the speed of modern life. In discussing the garden as experienced by the 18th century artist traveler in comparison with the American traveling abroad in the early 20th century, she said that, quote, artists were not distracted by the multitude of photographs and rapid mental impressions of travel, which with us make individuality so difficult to keep, end quote. Both Merritt and Farrand seem to use the term impression and impressionist as a shorthand for speed and lack of focus, rather than a positive, spontaneous style for capturing nature. But later in the same essay, Farrand argues that, quote, a garden, large or small, must be treated in an impressionist manner, and that, quote, One of the most important things that the Impressionist school has been trying to teach us is that shadow is a color and must be seen as one. And the reason why the eye seeks relief from a flat surface is not only that it is instinctively resents monotony, but that it feels the need of shadow. What are we to make of these often contrary invocations of Impressionism? What they do seem to reveal is the overwhelming presence and influence of Impressionist techniques and modes of vision, but also a reluctance to wholeheartedly embrace the aesthetic. Many of the artists included in the exhibition had complicated relationships with Impressionism. Artists such as Twachtman and Thomas Wilmer Dewing might be better described as tonalists. Henry Hugh Breckinridge and Philip Leslie Hale experimented with Impressionism, but they also dabbled in abstraction and academic styles. Can an illustrator like Violet Oakley be described as an Impressionist? Rather than stylistic similarities, what unites these artists is their deep artistic engagement with their gardens and their obsessive repetition of certain themes, flowers, and compositions. Many of these artists were commuters who taught in the city but lived along the lines of suburban train or trolley car suburbs, including Breckinridge and Oakley, shown here in Philadelphia, Twachtman in New York City, and the Hales in Boston. These artists were exactly the class of educated urban professionals that were the audience for the mushrooming garden publication industry and culture. Much as our current obsession with the lives of celebrities can be deduced from looking at the cover of magazines on display at any corner store or airport terminal kiosk, a perusal of the emergent form of home and garden magazines at the turn of the 20th century reveals the interconnectedness of American artists and their gardens, as well as the public taste for and knowledge of these gardens. Living in railroad suburbs, artist colonies, or rural retreats, artists were some of the most recognizable members of this newly emergent class. On the gardens of artists at the Cornish Art Colony, Francis Duncan wrote in 1906, quote, "A garden is not sacred. It is simply an outgrowth of the house, an out-of-door living room, to be used and changed if one pleases. Perhaps the intimacy of gardens and owners is due to the fact that no Cornish garden is given over to the care of a hireling," end quote. The idea that gardens are not the work of the hired man, but of individual homeowners, perhaps the artist, is key in much of the garden literature of the period. American Impressionist artists and their peers were minor celebrities, and their gardens and lifestyles were featured in publications of the period, much as homes of film stars might be featured in Architectural Digest today. John Henry Twachtman, perhaps the artist most associated with suburban retreat, began his artistic training in Cincinnati before going to Munich. From 1875 to 1877, he traveled around Europe and the US before studying at the Académie Julian in Paris in 1882. He began teaching at the New York Art Students League in 1889, at which time he bought this small house of 17 acres in Connecticut outside Greenwich, which he named Willowbrook. During the 1890s, he turned again and again to the house, its garden and brook, flowers and family as subjects of his paintings. Twachtman's garden was a popular destination to fellow artists of the 10. In 1895, Art Amateur wrote, quote, "Mr. Twachtman's country house seems to be a regular rendezvous for Impressionists. It has always been painted by several." On May 1894 visit to Greenwich, Theodore Robinson wrote, quote, "The country fresh and lively. Twachtman, as usual, making a trellis or porch for vines." One can see these trellises and vines in Twachtman's paintings of his home. Even after his death in 1902, his garden continued to be a pilgrimage spot of sorts, and was the subject of a 1905 article in Country Life, which stated of the artist, quote, Throughout his Greenwich years, he returned to the same subjects, never tiring of painting views of his house from the back and front, his garden and surrounding landscape. Twachtman's preoccupation with his garden can be seen not only in the care he took in designing his house, but in the myriad painted sketches he did of native flowers in his garden. In Goldenrod and Wild Aster, the artist takes a worm's eye view of wild native plants growing on his property. His field of vision is surrounded by plants which seem to blow in the breeze and move on the canvas. Considered a weed by some, goldenrod was beloved by others. In 1894 edition of the Wildflowers of America, the author stated, quote, "We in this country have a great love of the goldenrods. Although there are a few species in Europe and in other parts of the world, the genus Solidago reaches its highest development in North America." Twachtman's treatment of the flowers differs greatly, however, from Charles Curran's goldenrod of 1916. Both Curran and Twachtman faithfully represent the plant, but Curran uses the flower to echo the graceful pose of his female standing figure and reveals his formal interest in the similarity of garden and female forms. Curran wrote, one of the pleasantest ways to paint flowers out of doors is in combination with figures, particularly of women and children, and colors are echoed in the many-hued reflection in their faces. Twachtman's garden was not only a place for a detailed study of plants, but a place of recovery and retreat. In a letter to his friend J. Alden Weir in December of 1891, he wrote, "I feel more and more contented in the isolation of country life. To be isolated is a fine thing, and we are then nearer to nature. I can see now how necessary it is to live always in the country at all seasons of the year." Like his fellow American artist Anna Lee Merritt and many other Americans, Twachtman saw his garden as a retreat from the bustle of the city. In this way, both Twachtman and Merritt were unlike many of the French impressionists whose garden paintings celebrated the fleeting momentariness of life in Paris. As Kathleen Pine has shown, interest in mind cures and therapeutic nature of the garden was a particular part of American Impressionist interest and depiction of the garden. A 1910 article in Country Life proselytized this gospel. Housebound women, office enslaved men, tired, nervous, world-weary people, compelled at last to make nature their soil. In the soil one must dig to discover the great elixir of playfellow, find in gardening health for the body and the life. In particular, it seems to be the garden in winter that is most associated with this idea of renewal and escape from the city. For instance, Helena Ely's 1916 publication, The Practical Flower Gardener, begins in the late winter with a visit of the winter town dweller to the near country, where in mid-March he sees life emerging out of the melting snow. And quote, "The town dweller returns to the noisy city of brick and stone, possessed by the longing that spring calls forth, to be at work amongst growing things and watch nature as she comes to life." Anna Lee Merritt structures her book on the garden by the seasons, starting with A Garden in Midwinter and ending with Goodbye Summer. As she describes her garden in winter, she could easily be describing this winter scene by John Twachtman. Quote, "It is the end of December. The little village nestles in a narrow valley between great towns. All life is at ebb. A few days ago, the whole earth was clothed in shimmering white, radiating a light of its own, until about noon, low down near the horizon, the pearly veil of the sky's great face was breathed aside, and a saffron gleam, like the flash in an opal, shot across the snow and into our hearts, where we called it hope." She writes of the need for rest, of the long twilight of midwinter days, of repose and eternity. One might be tempted to ask, is this really a book about gardening? It is, but in the publication, as in others, the garden is a metaphor for all sorts of things. It is a place to deal with anxiety, a place to escape the world. Similarly, Twachtman says, we must have snow and lots of it. Nature is never more lovely than when it was snowing. Everything is so quiet and the whole earth seems wrapped in a mantle. The feeling of quiet and all nature is hushed to silence. While for some artists, the garden was a space of retreat, for others, it was a site of technical innovation. This was particularly the case for Mariah Oakey Dewing. She first studied at the Cooper Union School of Design in New York, and then with John Lafarge and William Morris Hunt, and helped found the New York Art Students League. In addition to her work as a painter, she wrote 2 books, Beauty in Dress and Beauty in the Household, in the 1880s. After her marriage to Thomas Wilmer Dewing in 1881, her artistic career has long seen as being eclipsed by that of her husband. However, a study of her gardening and painting practice at the Dewing home, Dove Ridge in Cornish, New Hampshire, where the Dewings spent their summers from 1885 to 1903, makes it clear that her artistic practice was channeled into her innovative flower painting. Oakey Dewing, subscribing to the current middle-class vogue for gardening, did the majority of the work in her garden, an intimate relationship that made her paintings very unique. In a 1915 article entitled, quote, Flower Painters and What the Flower Offers to Art, Dewing writes beautifully of the intense study required to be a successful flower painter, and that, quote, one must bind themselves to long apprenticeship in a garden, end quote. In her prose and painting, Dewing sees flowers in detailed close up with the background blurred. In The Rose Garden, 1901, morning glories make an appearance, letting us know the time of day, morning. The roses are modern hybrid perpetual roses, and they fill the entirety of the canvas. Dewing's long acquaintance with the flowers in her Cornish garden bore fruit in her view of iris, rose, and poppies. Indeed, the art critic Royal Cortizos wrote of her flower paintings that she painted, quote, literally their portraits, end quote. This reference to portraiture is interesting, as late in life, Oakey Dewing mourned the fact that she had given up large figure and landscape paintings to paint flowers. Perhaps this accounts for the uniqueness of her flower paintings. They are not still lifes, but portraits, and ambitious full-scaled ones at that. They take on the format of horizontal landscape paintings rather than the traditional small scale of still lifes. Like Oakey Dewing, Thomas Shields Clark came from a well-off family. He attended Princeton University before studying at the Art Students League, and then in Paris. After exhibiting at the Paris Salon as a painter, he turned to sculpture, for which he was most recognized in his own time. In 1902, he hired Philadelphia architect Wilson Eyre, who had also designed Stephen Parrish's house in Cornish, to design Fernbrook, his arts and crafts style studio, house, and garden in Lenox, Massachusetts. The gardens were decorated with Clark's sculpture and the setting for his fabulous series of autochromes that he produced in 1919. Autochromes were an expensive cutting-edge glass plate photography process, which consisted of glass plate coated on one side with a random mosaic of microscopic grains of potato starch dyed red, orange, green, and blue-violet, which acted as color filters. Clark published a selection of these prints of the autochromes in his illustrated article, Color Studies in My Garden, from Country Life in 1919. Despite Clark's appellation of these autochromes as studies, they are in fact fully articulated, composed, and highly finished works of art. Beginning around 1910, he produced hundreds of these, which could only be afforded by an artist as wealthy as Clark. The technology was extremely fugitive, which explains why the autochrome technique was quickly abandoned. The color produced in these images is fabulous. They were taken at all seasons and include landscapes, photos of models in Grecian costumes, still lifes saturated with colors, cut flowers from the garden. And in this one, you can see women in modern dress posed in a foreground, paralleling a stand of white lilies, which kind of reminds me of Curran with the flowers, the painting we saw. In the background, a young woman communes with one of Clark's garden sculptures, leaning forward in a mirror image of a sculpted winged Victory. And again, it does remind me of Curran, where women echo and balance the forms of flowers. But Clark also structured his color studies, particularly still lives, in strikingly formal ways. He had a brilliant eye for structural and color contrast. And you can see in the image on the right, pansies tumble out of a small jade-colored bowl, and tilting afternoon light filters through an arrangement of berries onto a small Tanagra figure. Another formal innovator in the garden was Henry Hugh Breckinridge. And I'm showing you here his school in Valley Forge, which he centered at his home in Floxdale, called Floxdale in Fort Washington. It was in this garden that he created his best impressionist paintings and taught many of his students. Breckinridge was a connoisseur of phlox. In photographs of his garden, Phlox paniculata can be seen growing in abundance. And this plant was also the primary subject matter of some of his best work in his impressionist mode. While Breckinridge is clearly interested in these flowers, he is not doing portraits of them like did Oki Doing, but he's really interested in how color vibrates and the different shadows and application of paint. He's also suggesting the human presence in landscape by putting paths in his work. And I would encourage you, in Artists as Cultivators, we have some later works by Breckinridge, not done in his impressionist style, but his modernist style. So you'll just have to come and see those. Another group of PAFA artists, Violet Oakley, Elizabeth Shippen Green, and Jessie Wilcox Smith, known as the Red Rose Girls. The garden was a artistic metaphor and generative space. These three artists met at PAFA and decided to combine their careers and lives together to nurture each other's artistic practice. In their illustrations for popular magazines, women and children were often set against a backdrop of garden imagery. In a photograph of the three women illustrators in their Chestnut Street studio, their companion, Henrietta Cousins, is poised above them, watering can aloft. The artists are wearing artist smocks and each is holding a rose. In another photograph, Jessie Wilcox Smith and Elizabeth Shippen Green posed in the enclosed garden at Cogsley, the site of their second root home in the Mount Airy suburb of Philadelphia. Henrietta Cousins was not a visual artist, but it was she who maintained the gardens at Cogsley, as we can see from the playful photograph of her watering her roses. She was a caretaker and nurturer of the professional Oakley, Shippen Green, and Wilcox Smith. Two impressionist painters to finally consider from the perspective of gendered gardens are Lillian Westcott and Philip Leslie Hale. They were based in Boston, even though they had studied in New York City and Paris. And in 1888, Philip Leslie Hale began to spend his summers in Giverny and came under the influence of Impressionism. In 1902, he married fellow artist Lillian Westcott, and they settled in the Dedham suburb of Boston, where Philip did a series of paintings of women in the garden, while Lillian focused on highly accomplished drawings set in the interior of their home. In The Crimson Rambler, house, garden, and woman become one. Vines, shrubs, and creepers were incredibly popular in the period, and the Rambler spreads over the inorganic form of the house. In an article called Lessons from English Cottage Gardens, Wilhelm Miller proposes how to develop an American style in cottage or suburban gardens and states, quote, "Our cottages should be nearly covered with climbers," end quote. Hale is very specific about the variety of flowers that he includes in his paintings. They are not there for purely formal color or decorative effects, but the Crimson Rambler was a very specific flower, which was imported from Japan via Great Britain to the US in 1894. In this painting, Hale idealizes the Rambler, much as he idealizes his woman in white. The bloom is considerably larger than it would have grown. And his woman is just as ideal as his plant in terms of beauty. In the sun bath, the flowers are hollyhocks, and they echo the billowing white sheaths that the women wear to bathe in the sun of their suburban backyard. Hale used photography to help him achieve the balance between figures and flowers. In all three of these works, most particularly this work here, Hale has set up a contrast between the forms of the woman and the forms of the flowers. They almost seem to mirror each other. Philip Hale's brightly colored oil canvases of garden exteriors of his house stand in contrast to Lillian Westcott Hale's depiction of interior landscapes. She excelled at charcoal drawing set in interiors. During the period that her husband painted large oils outdoors, she completed a series of intimate portraits in charcoal of women and girls named for specific flowers, including Gardenia Rose and Black-Eyed Susan. These charcoals are amongst the most accomplished and sought after of her works. Rather than painting women mirrored by floral forms like her husband did, Westcott Hale seems to almost ironically draw women as flowers. And I say ironically because while she titles these drawings after particular flowers, they are in fact individual portraits of women and girls that she knew, rather than models that she paid to work for her, as did her husband. Whether the garden was a site of removal and retreat, a site of technical innovation, or a space of highly gendered artistic practice, the garden was an integral element of the artistry of painters, photographers, and illustrators. Remarkably varied in their stylistic approach to the garden, nevertheless, the artists that we talked about today embody the diversity of artists associated with American Impressionism and the garden movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start taking in questions, and I think it would be great to we'll try to just unmute ourselves or write them in the chat, and then I can read them aloud. But if people have questions, please go ahead and let's start the question and answer. We have about 7 minutes. And I have a question.
Julie, is that you?
Yes, that's me.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. I haven't seen the cultivators exhibit. Can you explain how this exhibit from 2015 fed into that? And I would imagine that also reflects things that you learned from this exhibit and how you've used that knowledge since and all this other work that you've done.
Sure. Thank you, Julie, for that question. So when my colleague Leah started here about a year ago, we realized we had an opportunity to do an exhibition in the Historic Landmark Building. And we knew we were going to be installing it in February, and that we wanted it. Somebody said, well, it would be great to do something that would line up with the flower show. And I said, oh, well, I did that show in 2015. So at first we were like, well, let's just redo that show. And then we decided, no, we're not going to redo that show. But we took the concept of the garden in that particular moment, the progressive era, and thought about some of the interesting parallels going up to today. So we took a number of the works that were created for Rising Sun, which deal with the idea of artists as cultivators, cultivators of community, as care, and the idea that we're all connected on this earth. And so we put together a show of over 120 objects from the 18th century to made last year to bring in this discussion of artists as cultivators. So you won't see all of those Impressionist paintings, but you will see some Impressionist paintings like the Jane Peterson in discourse with works from throughout the 20th and 21st century. So it's a whole new exhibition that fed on the commissions for Rising Sun, the scholarship for artist cultivators, and then Leah coming in and bringing her emerging knowledge about the collection, as well as a focus show on the artistic career of Ruth Fine, to tie in with this citywide celebration refocus. And we, in that print show, which is a smaller version of the show, we look at Ruth's practice of printmaking in the garden. So we tied it all together. So Julie, you're going to come see the show now, right?
Yes, I will come see the show. And will this show have the sort of fabulous catalog that Artist Garden had, or is that a thing of the past?
Well, the catalog is still available in our gift shop and on Amazon, if you don't have it, but I know you do have it, Julie.
Oh, no, I'm talking about this current show. Oh,
yes,
of course
yeah.
I have the, of course I have the-
No, I had a longer lead time for the Artist Garden. So Leah and I did not have an opportunity to create a catalog for this exhibition.
Anna, there's a question from Eric. Is there a distinction to be made about whether the artists were trained to render gendered topics for magazine publications versus those artists who understand their paintings to be fine art, whether professional or as a pastime?
That's a great question. And yes, I think that the artists, particularly the illustrators and the Red Rose Girls, were very savvy about how to use gender in their illustrations, because Philadelphia was such a center for publications. It was the Curtis Publishing was built on the Ladies' Home Journal, which was the most popular publication of the time period. And the Curtis Publishing employed many artists in it, and they like to work with particularly Jessie Wilcox Smith because she was so known for her images of women and children. So that would be different than Violet Oakley, who not only did illustrations, but was a painter and a muralist. So she's doing different things in her style and kind of using gender in different ways. And then they're creating their own kind of safe space in their garden in Mount Airy, a space for same-sex relationships.
Great. We have 1 minute, and I just wanted to know if there's no other questions. I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about the burgeoning environmental movement that was part of the discussions at the turn of the century.
Yeah, there's a great essay in the catalog by Alan Braddock. And he talks particularly in that essay, he's who I learned about all the bird conservation movements, and how women like Delia Thaxter, women who were part of the Garden Club of America, but also the Audubon movement, were all about protecting gardens and birds. Now, a lot of those same people were also nativists, so they were anti-immigration. But Alan Braddock's work in general is looking at eco-critical approaches. And I would say that artists from, the 18th century are at least are thinking eco-critically about landscapes and very aware of how urbanization and the development of cities was affecting natural species of plants and animals.
Thanks. All right, we are just past 1 o'clock. I want to thank you so much, Anna, for this lecture. Thank you all for coming today. And I hope to see you at our next Art at Noon on May 29th with Leah Triplett Harrington, Anna's co-creator for this exhibition. Take care, everyone.
Thank
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I see Jennifer, an old friend from other parts of the countries, and I see a lot of old friends. Thank you. Sorry, I have to run and give a tour, or I would stay and talk to everyone, but I'll see you all again online soon.